treasure, that of a sojourner, travels around and round, but not from town to town. Travels the lakes and streams, follows his distant dreams. Peace on the waterways, blue sky, no cloudy day. My heart has one but home, from which I'll never roam. Land of true happiness, Canadian wilderness.
Hey class, Mr. Swenside here. Well, we cruised through Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, learning about the early Dakota and early Ojibwe. Now we are going to introduce some European settlers, well, not really settlers, but more explorers, right? So, and we start to look at people coming from the east, from Canada. We introduce the Voyagers, and what we are talking about is the fur trade. So, going to learn about that. Again, might learn some things differently, so take some good notes. We'll talk about it tomorrow in class. Have fun. The learning objectives for this chapter are: number 1, compare and contrast the purpose of trade in American Indian and European cultures. Number 2, tell why explorers and missionaries came to Minnesota. Number 3, list some key trade items desired by both American Indians and Europeans. 4, describe fur trade activities that happened during all 4 seasons. And 5, explain the roles of people involved in the fur trade. The first Europeans to explore the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and ultimately Minnesota were French explorers, missionaries, and fur traders. In 1534, Jacques Cartier became the first Frenchman to enter the St. Lawrence River, following the route that would take others to Lake Superior and Minnesota. Subsequent expeditions expanded the area known to Europeans and available to fur traders. Travelers created maps and kept journals and later wrote books about their experiences. Most explorers admitted the fact that American Indian guides had led them through the area. Sometimes these guides intentionally kept Europeans away from important sites. For example, American Indians were familiar with the location of the source of the Mississippi River, but they did not lead Europeans there until 1832. Lake Minnetonka, a special site to the nearby Dakota, was not known to Europeans until 1852. Many, but not all, of the first Europeans to venture into a region now called Minnesota were fur traders. Some were explorers in search of fame and adventure. Others were missionaries who wanted native people to give up their religion in favor of Christianity. Explorers Radisson and Groseilliers were among the first to arrive in the region. They probably ventured into the region during the 1650s. In 1680, 2 Frenchmen and a Catholic priest from Belgium named Louis Hennepin traveled up the Mississippi River to the lands of the Dakota. Hennepin later wrote a book about his adventures. His wildly exaggerated stories made him famous and sparked Europeans' curiosity about the upper Mississippi River Valley. In most places, people traded things they had for goods they could not get themselves. For instance, the American Indians received things such as useful metal goods such as knives, kettles, guns, and needles. They got blankets and jewelry, but the Europeans wanted something different. They traded to make money. Goods such as spices from Asia, gold from Africa, or furs from North America could be sold for a lot of money in Europe. Rich Europeans were willing to pay high prices for these rare items. This meant that the traders could make a profit. European traders could use that profit to buy things they could not afford otherwise. So in Europe, making a profit what was mattered in the trading business. In North America, the Ojibwe and Dakota traded for things they wanted or needed, not to make a profit. These two worlds, European and American Indian, met in what we now call the fur trade. The Great Lakes fur trade was an exchange that changed much over the course of 2.5 centuries, roughly spanning 1600 to 1850. Not only did the geographic centers of trade shift over time, but so too did the dominance of different American Indian and European nations. In the 1600s to the 1700s, the French established numerous outposts throughout southern Quebec and Ontario, as well as around the Great Lakes. lakes, eventually claiming control over a vast portion of the interior of North America. Because the French were interested in trade, not colonizing, they were open to adapting American Indian culture and social ways to their lifestyle. Thus, they often had good relations with the American Indian nations. During the same period, the British established colonies on the eastern seaboard that grew rapidly and began to expand westward. The British colonists made no effort to adopt American Indian ways and instead pushed native people off their land. Frequent armed conflicts made many American Indian nations reluctant to ally with the British. By the mid-1700s, the British outnumbered the French in North America, and they had defeated the French. France was forced to withdraw its political control in North America, ceding Canada to Britain in the 1763 Treaty of Paris. And as we talked about in our Civil War studies, in 1803, France sold their claim on the vast territory of Louisiana to the United States. This was called the Louisiana Purchase. The British controlled the fur trade from that point on until the Americans attained territorial dominance in the Great Lakes region. And after the treaty ending the War of 1812, the U.S. government passed legislation requiring all outfits involved in the fur trade to be run by U.S. citizens. In the land that is now Minnesota, the fur trade went through many changes. During the early 1700s, the Ojibwe and the Dakota traded mostly with the French. In the mid-1700s, Great Britain and France fought over control of North America in the French and Indian War in the mid-1700s. After Britain won the war, the Ojibwe and Dakota usually did business with the British. By the beginning of the 1800s, a few big companies controlled the fur trade in North America. In the land of the Ojibwe and the Dakota, the biggest fur trading company was the British-owned Northwest Company. Late each summer, crews of men set out from the Northwest Company's large trading post at Grand Portage. They headed for fur posts throughout areas that now make up northern and central Minnesota. In 1804, one of those crews left to establish a new Northwest Company trading post on the Snake River in present-day Pine County. The lands around the Snake River were a mixture of forest, wetlands, and prairie. The Ojibwe controlled much of that area, but the Dakota were nearby. For 6 months, the Ojibwe and the Northwest Company did business at the new post on the Snake River. The things that happened there during the trading season of 1804 to 1805 can tell us a lot about how the fur trade actually worked. The fall was a time where a lot of trading happened at the trading post. In this case, the Native Americans were getting ready for the hunt in the winter, so they would trade for goods such as ammunition, guns, tobacco, things that would help them be successful for their winter hunt. During this time, Voyagers would be at the main trading posts where they'd be cutting firewood for the winter. They would be building or repairing the post. They may be even transporting some trade goods to fur trading posts, either within the state, or there was even some trips where they would come from Montreal to Minnesota. During this time, dry meat and fish was processed. Wild rice was obviously being harvested and processed. And there would just be general oversight of the day-to-day operations at the fur post. During the winter, this was the time where the Native Americans hunted for deer, bear, muskrats, and beaver. Sometimes the Voyagers would help with this as well. There was a lot of preparation of animal pelts for trade. So the men would do the hunting, and the Native American women would prepare the animal pelts. During this time, there was still some exchanging, some trading going on, as well as overseeing of day-to-day operations of the fur posts. The Ojibwe would, or this trading would be done at winter camps, right? For trade, for food and for goods that are going to help the Native Americans with hunting, and food that will help the Voyagers and traders, clerks, employees at the post have food for the winter. Spring was the time to get ready for the summer rendezvous. So there was some hunting that continued, some preparation for the pelts that the Native Americans did. There continued to be an exchange of trade goods. During this time, there was the final delivery of pelts, any debts that need to be paid off, overseeing of day-to-day operations of the fur posts. They also repaired canoes because They had to help repair the canoes as the Voyagers made the trip back to Montreal to deliver the pelts that they received during their rendezvous. The Native Americans during this time obviously helped act as guides and interpreters during this trip. In the summer, it was time to celebrate. Traders, clerks, and voyagers met at the rendezvous, the summer meeting at Grand Portage. They brought with them thousands of tons of pelts. During the weeks that followed, workers counted, repacked, and loaded the pelts for the trip through the Great Lakes to Montreal. From there, sailing ships would carry the pelts across the Atlantic Ocean to London, Paris, and European cities. At the same time, huge canoes arrived from Montreal carrying tons of manufactured goods. As the boats were unloaded, traders collected the goods they had ordered for the coming season. Before long, voyagers would make the journey to bring these goods to the wintering posts, where the cycle of trading would begin again. During this time, the Native Americans would return to their summer camps. Workers of the fur trade. So the trader was also known as the wintering partner. He was the one in charge of one or more trading posts. The more furs that he collected, the more money he made, the more profit he made. The trader could read and write and often came from a wealthy family, had a very high social position, and they traveled from post to post over the winter to oversee progress. The clerk worked under the partner, sometimes put in charge of an entire trading post, sometimes just managed the day-to-day business at the post, keeping accounts, supervising trade, packing pelts. The clerk could read and write as well, but didn't hold the same social position as the trader. They were often young men looking to become traders. You then have the Voyagers. We know what the Voyagers are, as we all lived as a Voyager through our diaries, but they were the ordinary workmen of the fur trade, right? So couldn't read, couldn't write, were often young French Canadians. They did all the work, right? Hauled the heavy loads, paddled the canoes, and they needed to be strong. They needed to have good endurance to do their job. Then you've got the hunters, which were the Native American men. Obviously, they're the ones that are going out in the winter and hunting for the beaver pelts. You then have the Pelt Preparers. These were were Native American women. So we talked about how often in these stories you don't hear a lot about the American Indian woman, but they did a lot. They were, they did a lot of the behind the scenes work, if you will. So, but very critical work to the fur trade and to the livelihood of the Native American people. They prepared the pelts. There were ones that provided wild rice, maple sugar, materials to make and repair canoes. They often became interpreters. Many of these women were married to voyagers and or traders, explorers, clerks, just to help build that relationship. So then you've got the Pelt Preparers, which we've talked about, and the guides and interpreters, which were obviously helped throughout the voyages from Montreal to Minnesota to Grand Portage and within the trading posts throughout Minnesota. Read about human capital and profit during the fur trade. Hit pause, and when you're ready to move on, press play. For your reflection, I want you to think about the questions above. What welcome changes did trade bring, and what changes were not so welcome? We'll discuss this more in class tomorrow.